All right, everyone, welcome back to the Kyle Lanslone Show. And we have a massive show for everyone today. Al-Qaeda has taken control of Syria, and we have to break it all down. If you're watching mainstream media, listening to American or Israeli politicians, this is presented as a great day for freedom, justice. A dictator was deposed, and now the Syrian people have a chance to thrive. But I'm going to explain why this is a real negative and mainly for the American people. So we have a lot to talk about on today's show because so much happened in Syria over the past 2 weeks. This has been a frozen conflict for some time. And then over the course of 12 days, this group, Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, took major Syrian cities and ultimately forced Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad to flee the country. He's now in Russia. So how did all this happen? We'll definitely get into that and talk about some of that on today's show. But we have to talk about this group HTS first, because this is presented as some reformist group, some plucky Syrian rebels, almost like the rebels in Star Wars that overthrew an evil dictator and are now said to bring justice to Syria, freedom to the Syrian people. But that's not at all what's going on. So HTS has its roots in Al-Qaeda in Iraq, when its leader, that's al-Jolani, was under the umbrella of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. In fact, al-Jolani isn't unlike some Americans who were inspired to fight after 9/11, except Jolani was inspired by the death of 3,000 American citizens to go to Iraq and fight on behalf of Al-Qaeda. This is a man that hates Americans, hates America, and he is now in control of Damascus. In fact, as Jolani rose through the ranks of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, he eventually became the leader of the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, the al-Nusra Front. And then in 2016, in coordination with the leadership of Al-Qaeda, al-Jolani broke ties with Al-Qaeda in order to appeal more to the West and to other Syrian rebel groups. So it wasn't a shift in mindset or philosophy or religious views, but rather a political move to be more acceptable to Washington, to the CIA, and to the Syrian people. He then rebranded again, and that's where we get the name HTS from in 2017. And while if you watch CNN or listen to anywhere in the mainstream media, this is presented as a real move away from the Al-Qaeda ideology. But in fact, what Jolani was doing at this time was opening the doors to HTS, or to the al-Nusra Front, back to the members of the Islamic Caliphate. After Baghdadi's caliphate was destroyed, the Islamic State was destroyed, there were some ISIS fighters that looked to move back under the Al-Qaeda umbrella. And so that's what HTS is. It's a combination of al-Nusra and ISIS. And again, their leader, al-Jolani, now controls Damascus. So let's see what the Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, has to say about all this.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its suppression. But it also means we have to take action against possible threats. One of them is the collapse of the Separation of Forces Agreement from 1974 between Israel and Syria. This agreement held for 50 years. Last night it collapsed. The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel. This is a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found. Equally, we send a hand of peace to all those beyond our border in Syria, to the Druze, to the Kurds, to the Christians, and to the Muslims who want to live in peace with Israel. We're going to follow events very carefully. If we can establish neighborly relations and a peaceful relations with the new forces emerging in Syria, that's our desire. But if we do not, we'll do whatever it takes to defend the state of Israel and the border of Israel.
Listen to Netanyahu talk about this. It's a great day. It's an opportunity. Why would Al-Qaeda ruling Damascus be an opportunity? Why would that be a good thing? And of course, like pretty much all other times regarding Middle East policy, the viewpoint of Netanyahu represents the consensus in Washington, and that is what's happened in Syria is a good thing. Now, why does Netanyahu believe this? Well, because he sees Iran as a bigger threat than Sunni jihadists. In fact, this was explicitly stated by a former Israeli official early in the Syrian civil war, when the rise of ISIS was happening, when Baghdadi was seizing cities in eastern Syria and then eventually Mosul in Iraqi cities. He was, carrying out ethnic cleansing of minority groups, taking women as set slaves, these abhorrent acts that ISIS was committing. At the time, Israel was saying, well, we prefer the Sunni jihadist evil to the Iran, to Assad and the Shia, because then they believe this creates a Shia crescent that stretches from Iran, Iraq, and Syria to southern Lebanon and Hezbollah, and that presents a unique threat to Israel. And so Israel has wanted to crush Syria, to destroy the Syrian state. I think they had their eyes on a little bit of Syrian territory, but beyond that, they just want no other states could stand up to what they're doing to the Palestinians in the region. And Bashar al-Assad, and especially what he was aligned with Tehran and Moscow, he was able to do that. Of course, with his quick fall, not so much at the end. So now let's move on and see what Joe Biden says the U.S. net actions are regarding Syria.
Looking ahead, the United States will do the following. First, we'll support Syria's neighbors, including Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Israel. Second, we will help ensure stability in eastern Syria. Third, we will engage with all Syrian groups, including within the process led by the United Nations, to establish a transition away from the Assad regime.
So, of course, this is just a fantasy that there's going to be some kind of good transition in Syria. We've already seen that al-Nusra, al-Qaeda has taken control, and I think they're very unlikely to relinquish that control. And our airstrikes are already pouring into Syria from all sides. So this hasn't been a good move for the Syrian people. However, let's look at what the consensus in Washington says. And we have this article here from Brett Stevens at the New York Times, where he says Syrians also have Israel to thank for their liberation. And in the article, he writes, yet this is a moment of opportunity for a country that has been in dictatorship since it became independent in the 1940s. Political prisoners, including one former pilot who spent 43 years in prison for refusing to bomb the regime's domestic opponents, are being freed. Millions of Syrians driven from their homes by 13 years of civil war and repression have a chance to return. And again, this is the viewpoint in Washington. This is the consensus right here, that what has happened in Syria is a good thing. We already have reports of these HTS fighters carrying out summary execution on the sides of the road. The reports vary whether these people were just killed because they were a religious minority in Syria or whether they were former fighters of Assad's government, but they were clearly in civilian clothes at the time and executed on the side of the road by men wearing Islamic State and other jihadist patches on their shirt. This is what the U.S. has backed and supported in Syria. And we could talk about that a little bit more right now, how much the U.S. has done over the past decade or so to bring about the fall of the Assad regime. The U.S. has allowed Israel to carry out near weekly airstrikes in Syria for over a decade. This really degraded the Syrian military, and I'm also sure it had impacts on how much other countries like Iran and Hezbollah were willing to have their fighters and their troops in Syria, knowing they were going to take such high casualties from airstrikes that the Syrian government had no ability to defend them from. Additionally, the U.S. put on a serious sanctions campaign against Syria, and this was meant to prevent the rebuilding of Syria. So after the country had been in a brutal civil war for over a decade, the U.S. intentionally prevented construction materials and other equipment needed to rebuild the country from entering Syria. Even when babies were freezing to death in Syria, the U.S. refused to lift those sanctions. Even following a massive earthquake in northeastern Syria that killed thousands of people in the country, again, no sanctions relief. In fact, at that time, Israel bombed the nearest airport to the destruction, preventing aid from reaching the people in need. These were the things that the U.S. and Israel have been doing, again, for over a decade to bring down the fall of the Assad regime. And so next up, let's look at what's actually happened to Syria after the fall of Assad. There's all kinds of countries bombing them. We have this article from The Guardian. 3 different countries are launching airstrikes in Syria. This includes the US, Israel, and Turkey. And the most serious airstrikes are coming from Israel. We have this article from The Cradle that shows Israel unleashes hell across Syria with over 250 strikes since the fall of Damascus. They write in the article, Israeli jets have launched well over 250 strikes across dozens of locations in the north, east, and west and south of Syria as of December 10th. And in fact, just before recording this show, I went and saw that there were 100 more strikes. And so Israel is admitting to 350 strikes in Syria in just the few days since the Assad government has fallen. Heavy airstrikes have destroyed weapons and arms depots, factories and research facilities, and all military airfields and naval bases since the extremist armed groups entered the capital Damascus and seized power Sunday morning. So does this sound like peace to you? Does this sound like a good day, a new day in Syria to you? The country is being absolutely pummeled from all sides as like vultures. The US, Turkey, our NATO ally Turkey, our, quote, strongest ally Israel, move in to feast on the remains of Syria. Israeli troops are penetrating deep into Syrian territory. In fact, there are reports that on the outskirts of suburbs of Damascus, they're only 15 to 25 kilometers away. These are serious intrusions into Syrian territory that is being committed by Israel right now. This is not benefiting the Syrian people whatsoever to have their country cut up and what's left of it ruled by an al-Qaeda state in Jolani. And apparently they've already started to impose Sharia areas, and particularly Aleppo. There's a lot of Christian communities there that are really worried about their ability to stay and remain in a city that they have been in, since nearly the time of Christ. And so this is a really big deal to have these types of people, these al-Qaeda guys in charge in Damascus once again. And of course, as a result of a dirty war that was backed and propped up by the United States all along. And so let's talk about the Israeli land grab. We have this statement from Matthew Miller at the State Department explaining Washington's position.
Israel has said that, since the first time since the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War has openly gone across the Golan Heights and said it's creating what it calls a temporary buffer zone. How do you feel about this? I mean, the UN has said that it's a violation. Does the United States agree? First of all, does the U.S. agree that it's a violation?
So let me say a few things about it. Number one, I think it's important to put in context what happened that led up to this event. First of all, the Syrian army abandoned its positions in the area around the negotiated Israeli-Syrian buffer zone, which potentially creates a vacuum that could have been filled by terrorist organizations that would threaten the state of Israel and would threaten civilians inside Israel. Every country has the right to take action against terrorist organizations, and every country, I think, would be worried about a possible vacuum that could be filled by terrorist organizations on its border, especially in volatile times, as we obviously are in right now in Syria. The second thing that is important is that Israel has said that these actions are temporary to defend its borders. These are not permanent actions. And so ultimately, what we want to see is lasting stability between Israel and Israel and Syria. And that means we support all sides upholding the 1974 disengagement agreement.
So the first thing I want to point out is this idea that the Israeli incursion into Syria is going to be temporary is completely ridiculous. And when you watch Matthew Miller say it, he says it and then he looks up at the gallery to see if they bought his lie. He knows he's lying when he says that, and yet he tries to sell it to the American people anyways. Now, of course, the other major part of that clip is not saying what he would have said if Russia took more Ukrainian territory, which is the international order of things that the United States bats says that borders can never change, and if Israeli forces are moving in and seizing Syrian territory, that this is a violation of international law, and Netanyahu, just like Vladimir Putin, should be facing charges at the ICC. Of course, that's not what the United States is going to do in this situation. They're going to back and obscure the Israeli incursion into Syria. And so he also, again, we have Matthew Miller trying to like kind of obscure this of why Israel would be interested in taking Syrian territory, but at the same time not explicitly saying that Al-Qaeda won the war in Syria, because of course Biden is celebrating Al-Qaeda winning the war in Syria. This is, a policy that stretched back over 3 American presidents, that started under Barack Obama in 2011, funneling jihadists after the Libyan war that deposed Gaddafi from Libya and their weapons into Syria. And those jihadists eventually, became the al-Nusra Front. And that's who the U.S. has been backing throughout this conflict, are these, jihadist rebels. And so that war was finally completed. And so Matthew Miller can't say that we waged a 14-year, 13-year long dirty war in Syria only to put Jolani, Mr. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in charge of Damascus, yet that's what we did. At the same time, he has to find some way to justify Israel's incursion into Syria. And so he says, there's terrorist elements that we're worried about. Well, who are the terrorist elements, Matthew Miller? They're the side that both the U.S. and Israel has been backing over the past 14 years. Israel, of course, bombing the Syrian government all the time, providing aid, particularly medical care, to wounded, even Al-Qaeda fighters fighting in Syria. The U.S., the main backer, of funneling all kinds of weapons into support to various groups throughout Syria, all to undermine the rule of Bashar al-Assad. And so now there's apparently a lot of debate in the Biden administration about what to do. Yes, we deposed Assad, but now the man that is ruling Damascus is, by State Department rule, a terrorist and has a $10 million bounty on his head. And so there's this article from the Washington Post that says U.S. officials are in contact with all the groups involved in the fighting in Syria, including the main group that ousted Assad, HTS, which was once affiliated with Al-Qaeda and remains on the U.S. terrorist list, the official said. As whether the U.S. government would strip the group of its terrorist designation, which would enable deeper U.S. contact and cooperation with them, the official would not rule it out. Again, you have a group that is Al-Qaeda, who are the enemies of the American people, right? These are the international jihadists. These are the ideological descendants of Osama bin Laden that ordered the 9/11 attacks that killed thousands of American citizens. These are the people that want to kill Americans. Iranians don't want to kill Americans. They're concerned about issues in the Middle East, but they have no idea or no desire or capability to come to the United States and attack the U.S. For that matter, Russia, Bashar al-Assad, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, all groups with no capabilities and no interest to attack the U.S. And yet we wage war against all these groups when most of the time it's a direct beneficiary to the same Sunni jihadist Al-Qaeda fighters that are the actual enemies of the American people. And why does this happen? Again, because it benefits Israel, because it destabilizes strong states in the Middle East, because it weakens Iran's geopolitical sway over the Middle East. And that's Israel's top concern at this point, because the Iranians are the most capable state of standing up to the Israelis as they carry out their ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people. So next up, we have a statement from one of the worst senators on the issue, Lindsey Graham, who is actually calling for the U.S. to take more action in Syria. He writes on X, "I appreciate the airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria, but it will not be enough. We have to ensure that roughly 50,000 ISIS prisoners in northeastern Syria, being held primarily by Kurdish prisons, are not released. We should not allow Kurdish forces who helped us destroy ISIS on President Trump's watch be threatened by Turkey or radical Islamists who have taken over Syria." And so this is kind of interesting, because at least Lindsey Graham is able to acknowledge that there's radical Islamists who have taken over Syria, but he's only doing it because it furthers his point that the U.S. needs to be doing more to essentially create an independent, autonomous Kurdish state east of the Euphrates River in Syria. Now, the main issue with this is America's NATO ally, Turkey, stands strongly against this policy. And this is part of the conflict of, the geopolitical tangle of the Syrian civil war that has existed for so long, that the U.S. is, on one hand, helping Turkey prop up Sunni jihadist radicals who are actually carrying out ethnic cleansing against Kurdish groups. And at the same time, you're propping up the Kurdish fighters, which is known as the Syrian YPG or the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. In fact, some people might remember, this is some time ago now, but back in the 2015, 2016 time, there used to be headlines that would read something along the lines of CIA-backed jihadists in Syria fight against Pentagon-backed Kurds in Syria. And you actually have U.S. government-backed forces fighting against each other. Again, this is just the massive geopolitical web that's been created in Syria, and this isn't some prospect, some potential for peace. Every single interest is going to come in and try to claw as much as they can out of the Syrian state, and ultimately it's the Syrian people who are going to suffer the most. Next up, we have some statements from another U.S. congressman who I think represents kind of two really important points that the establishment is going to make. So let's go to clip one from Mike Turner.
This has been an incredibly brutal civil war with hundreds of thousands of people dying, including the use of chemical weapons, and of course reminding people that the Obama administration had said this would be a red line, that we would use military force to stop the use of chemical weapons, then failing to do so. This is a Islamic militia that has risen up and has continued and now is successfully toppling the Assad regime. As your report indicated, it's al-Qaeda in its origins, but it opposes ISIS. It is Turkish-backed. This is a blow to Iran, a blow to Russia. We're seeing what is likely a disintegration in Syria. The big questions will be, what does this mean for the U.S.? What does it mean for Iran, Russia, the neighbors of Israel and Jordan, which are strong allies of the United States?
So he's already getting into it, that this is bad for Russia and Iran. This is seen as breaking the Shia Crescent, what they used to call Iran's land bridge from Iran to southern Lebanon, where they would arm and help out Hezbollah. Now, I want to say, I'm not sure how effective this land bridge has been recently, especially since October 7th. Israel has been carrying out heavy airstrikes in Syria, often reporting they're either hitting Hezbollah or Iranian targets. And so it's not as if Iran has had a free hand to just move weapons across Syria into southern Lebanon, because Israel was often hitting targets that they at least claimed were Iranian targets in Syria. Additionally, Iran will find other ways to smuggle and get weapons to Hezbollah. So it's not exactly completely severing the Shia Crescent, but giving recent developments in the Middle East, particularly the losses and assassinations that Israel has conducted against Hezbollah really over the past few months, that group has been degraded, and it probably will take Iran some additional time to start to carry out strikes. Now, there's a big question of what's going to happen to the Russian bases. And so can we play clip number 3 from Mike Turner?
Here, there is an opportunity for the parties, especially now that Iran and Russia's roles are going to be diminished. They have been brutal in their support with Assad. The hundreds of thousands of people, including the use of chemical weapons, that have been killed have been under the Russian influence there. Russia still has 2 bases, a naval and air force base there, that are going to be, both at risk for Russia, but also a risk to the population of Syria, because they have been used before to attack the Syrian population. We'll have to see what Russia does there. But this is going to be an area that's going to be highly volatile and in transition.
So I think this is one of the places that the American hawks are really going to have their claws out. They may have more interest here than actually Tel Aviv in evicting Russia from their military bases on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And so what exactly does that mean? Can they rally the HTS forces, the al-Qaeda forces, to try to drive the Russians out of their bases and claim, this is sovereign Syrian territory, HTS is the government of Syria, and we're demanding the Russians leave? I mean, that it would be awfully bold to bat the terrorists that much, but I think I could really see the Americans making this move because they're so dedicated to hurting Russia and Iran. They don't realize what it's going to do. Now, the big point I want to make on Syria here before we wrap up, and I've talked about time and time again how I think this is awful for the Syrian people. I also think this is a real risk to the American people. Again, we are talking about Osama bin Laden's philosophical, ideological descendants here in al-Jolani, now ruling Syria. You know, we saw the looting of the Syrian central bank. Syrian military just dropped their weapons and left their posts, and so these people are now lousy with guns and money. And what are they going to do with those guns and money? Well, we already know that there's a ton of anti-American sentiment building in the Middle East. Day after day, they see the destruction that the U.S. and Israel are waging and laying into Gaza. And when you look at the 9/11 terrorist attacks, it's not as if every terrorist was a Palestinian. They were from all over the Middle East who felt ideological connections with the Palestinians. And so if we see that again, there's going to be a lot of people in the Middle East, many of them may be already al-Qaeda members in Syria, who now have guns, money, room to operate, and a real hatred for Americans for what we did and what we helped the Israelis do to the people of Palestine, to the people of Gaza. All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening to my show today. We'll be back with another show soon.